At the height of their success, Radiohead did something that made no sense. They abandoned guitars, they hid their singer's voice, they refused to release singles, and they barely promoted the album at all. For a band coming off one of the most celebrated records of the 1990s, this wasn't evolution. It looked like self sabotage. Fans were confused, critics were divided, and many believed Radiohead had just ended their own career. This is the story of the album that almost ended Radiohead. By the late 1990s, Radiohead were no longer just a band. They were a statement. OK Computer had captured something many people didn't yet know how to articulate: anxiety about technology, isolation, and modern life. It felt prophetic, and the world responded. The album sold millions. It dominated critics' lists. It turned Radiohead into one of the most respected bands on the planet. But behind the scenes, the success was suffocating. The OK Computer tour was relentless. Large crowds, constant pressure, night after night performing songs that had become cultural artifacts rather than personal expressions. For Tom York, it was overwhelming. He later described feeling disconnected from his own voice, like he was playing a character instead of being himself. What looked like artistic triumph from the outside felt like emotional collapse from within. When the tour ended, York didn't feel inspired, he felt trapped. At this point in their career, the path forward was clear. Make another rock album, write bigger anthems, repeat the formula. That's what successful bands did, and it's what labels expected. But every attempt to write in that style felt wrong. York later admitted that guitars began to make him uncomfortable. The structures felt predictable. The sound felt dishonest. Radiohead weren't afraid of failure, they were afraid of repeating themselves. So instead of chasing success, they made a decision that terrified everyone involved. They stopped trying to sound like Radiohead. Radiohead disappeared from public view. When they returned, the band was unrecognizable. Instead of writing songs traditionally, they worked with loops, textures, and fragments. Instead of finishing lyrics, York wrote disjointed phrases meant to evoke feeling rather than meaning. They immersed themselves in electronic and experimental music, not as a trend, but as an escape. Artists like Aphex Twin and Autechre became reference points. So did jazz, ambient music, and krautrock. This wasn't about abandoning rock, it was about rejecting comfort. Even York's voice, once the emotional anchor, was distorted, filtered, or buried in the mix. For a band known for intimacy, this felt like a deliberate act of distance. When people first heard Kid A, many didn't know how to process it. There were no obvious singles, no soaring choruses, no moments that felt designed for radio. Songs drifted instead of exploded. Melodies dissolved. Lyrics felt fragmented and unsettling. Some listeners called it cold, others called it pretentious. But beneath the surface, Kid A was deeply emotional, just not in a familiar way. It reflected confusion, disconnection, a world accelerating faster than people could adapt. Rather than explain itself, the album demanded patience. And Radiohead offered no guidance, no interviews explaining the meaning, no attempt to soften the blow. They let the album exist on its own terms. From a career standpoint, Kid A was reckless. Radiohead had everything to lose. They were still young, they were still relevant, and they were still capable of dominating alternative rock. Instead, they gambled it all on an album that actively resisted accessibility. If it failed, they wouldn't just be a band that took a risk. They'd be remembered as a band that lost their audience. For many artists, this kind of move would have been the end, but something strange happened. Despite confusion and skepticism, Kid A debuted at number one, not because of hit singles, not because of radio play, but because people trusted Radiohead enough to follow them. Over time, opinions softened. What once felt alien began to feel visionary. What once felt cold began to feel honest. Listeners realized Kid A wasn't rejecting emotion, it was expressing a new kind of it. In the years that followed, Kid A became one of the most influential albums of its generation. It showed that mainstream success didn't require repetition, that alternative music could be challenging without being obscure, that rock bands could reinvent themselves without disappearing. Artists across genres took note. More importantly, Radiohead proved that artistic survival sometimes requires destruction of expectations, of identity, of comfort. Kid A didn't just change Radiohead, it changed what audiences were willing to accept from successful artists. Kid A almost ended Radiohead, it confused fans, it divided critics, and it rejected everything that had made them successful. But in doing so, it gave them something more valuable than popularity: freedom. And sometimes, the album that almost ends a band is the one that saves them. If you enjoy stories like this, the albums, artists, and moments that changed music forever, consider subscribing to the Music Archive. There are many more stories like this to come.